Thank you, Mary. It is lovely to be here with you. If I suddenly start coughing loudly and uncontrollably, don't rush up to administer anything to me. I'm at the tail end of a very long chest infection which doesn't want to go away, so ignore it as I will try and do. I stand before you as a second-generation survivor of the Holocaust, a premeditated crime involving the systematic industrialized murder of 6 million Jews during World War II. Why am I called second generation? Because both my parents survived the Holocaust. Let me start by looking briefly at Ireland's not-so-proud record prior to, during, and after the Holocaust. This country all but closed its doors to the Jews clamoring to escape from Nazi Germany. In 1938, Ireland's Justice Minister said, "In general, I think the Jewish community in this country should not be increased by way of immigration." In 1943, Deputy Oliver Flanagan used his maiden speech in the Dáil to utter this anti-Semitic diatribe. How is it that we do not see any of these emergency powers acts directed against the Jews who crucified our Savior 1900 years ago and who are crucifying us every day in the week? There is one thing that Germany did, and that was to rout the Jews out of their country. Until we rout the Jews out of this country, it doesn't matter a hair's breadth what orders you make. Where the bees are, there is honey, and where the Jews are, there is money. When Flanagan uttered his racist, anti-Jewish rantings, 4 million Jews had already been murdered in Europe. And needless to say, not a single deputy in the Dáil objected to Flanagan's words. In 2003, then Justice Minister Michael McDowell said that government policy in World War II was inspired by a culture of muted anti-Semitism. He continued, at an official level, the Irish state was at best coldly polite. Behind closed doors, the Irish state was antipathetic, hostile, and unfeeling towards the Jews. Describing Ireland's neutrality policy in World War II as morally bankrupt when it came to Jewish refugees, then Justice Minister Alan Shatter said in 2012 that the Irish state did not prevent our anti-Semitic ambassador to Berlin, Charles Bewley, from denying visas to Jews desperately trying to flee. Permit me a personal anecdote about Charles Bewley. In 2013, my late father was the guest speaker at Germany's official 75th Berlin commemoration of Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht was the 1938 state-sponsored pogrom in which synagogues were burnt to the ground, Jews were murdered, and 30,000 Jews were carted off to concentration camps. The 2013 ceremony was held in the same Berlin synagogue where my father watched being smashed up as a child from his bedroom window. While in Berlin, Mona and I attended an exhibition organized by the German Foreign Ministry, which had invited 48 countries that had diplomatic missions in Germany in 1938 to search their archives for reports from their diplomats sent as a result of Kristallnacht. It turns out that every diplomat condemned the murders and acts of violence and destruction. The British ambassador called it medieval barbarism. The Brazilians called it a disgusting spectacle. French diplomats wrote about scope of brutality only exceeded by the massacres of the Armenians. Even fascist Italy's diplomat wrote that it was unimaginable that the Jews in Germany will all be lined up against the wall one day. There was one sole exception among the 48 diplomats, Ireland's Charles Bewley, whose 13-page document condemned the undesirables in the Jewish race who dominated the worlds of finance and entertainment, and Bewley accused the Jews of using their influence to instill anti-Christian, anti-patriotic, and communistic thinking. And the exhibition's curator told us, of all the diplomatic reports, this one is unusually demagogic and nasty. So that's still our lingering reputation in Berlin, 21st century. In the 18 years I've lived in Ireland, I can't escape the impression that many Irish people simply don't or won't comprehend the enormity of the crime that we call the Holocaust. Both my parents were born and raised in Nazi Germany, and in the months before World War II, separately, they both managed to escape as teenagers to Britain, where they met on a kibbutz. Yes, you heard right. During World War II, there were several fully operational kibbutzim in Britain, where young Jewish Zionists, most of them refugees from the continent, like my parents, honed their agricultural skills to prepare themselves to become pioneers in what would become Israel. Under their wartime, excuse me, I didn't realize I'd brought a frog with me from Dundalk. Lodged in my throat. Under their wartime wedding canopy, in December 1944, my parents talk about the doodle bugs that were floating in the air above them. My parents made a vow. They vowed that they would rebuild the tribe that they already suspected had been annihilated by the Nazis. And this is the story that I tell in my book, The Vow. A few months after my parents made this vow, their worst suspicions proved to be all too true. The Holocaust devoured scores and probably hundreds of my father's family, including my grandparents, David Meir and Tilla Fachler. To this day, I don't know where, when, or how my grandparents were murdered. I don't know if it was in the Lodz ghetto where they were last heard of. I don't know if it was in the Treblinka death camp where over 100,000 members of the Lodz ghetto were taken. I don't know if they were murdered in a house, in a synagogue, in the street, in a camp, in a train, in a pit, in a field, or in a forest. I don't know if my grandparents were shot, clubbed to death, gassed, or starved. I don't even have a date when I can commemorate their departed souls. Unquestionably, the German Nazi regime was responsible for my family's murder. But Polish attitudes towards the Jews also needs some further scrutiny. In the mid-30s, Poland enacted a series of anti-Jewish measures just as the Germans had done at Nuremberg, with the Nuremberg laws. And in March 1938, excuse me, the Polish government announced a new citizenship law, whereby from October the 30th, 1938, the passports of Polish citizens who'd lived abroad for more than 5 years would be revoked if those citizens had not, in inverted commas, maintained contact with the home country. Tens of thousands of Polish Jews in Germany, including my father's parents, would have been rendered stateless on German soil, making them a German problem. So in order to solve that problem, one day before the Polish deadline, the SS and Gestapo arrested 15,000 Jews across Germany, including my grandfather, David Mehr, and sent them over the German border to Poland. But Polish border guards refused to allow these Polish citizens back into Poland. My grandfather and thousands of others spent the next 6 months in a railway siding in a place called Zbonjin. And I tell this story, and I tell the date of the story because it is significant. This so-called Polien Aktion, the Polish action, took place on the 28th and 29th of October. My father's 15th birthday fell on the 27th of October. He missed being arrested by 1 day. 1 day later, his name would have been on the list as a 15-year-old eligible for arrest. Among the people, together with my grandfather, in Zbonjin, was a family called Greenspan. The daughter, the mother, father, and daughter. And the daughter sent a postcard from this hamlet, railway siding, to her brother, who was a student living in Paris. And the postcard said, "We've been arrested, we're in this disgusting place, conditions are terrible, you've got to do something." So the brother, called Herschel, went and bought a gun, made his way to the German embassy in Paris, and fatally wounded the third secretary in the embassy. When he died, about 8-9 days later, this was the trigger for Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht was a plan waiting to be implemented, and this was the excuse. With my grandfather incarcerated in Zbonjin, my grandmother managed to get my father enrolled in one of the world's biggest and most important and quite famous escape plans, known as Kindertransport. Just in brackets, some of you may have been following the news in Britain in the last 2 or 3 weeks. Lord Alfred Dobbs, a lord in the House of Lords, came out and attacked the British government's policy regarding taking in child refugees. And he managed to change government policy. Lord Alfred Dobbs is a Kindertransport child. So my father managed to escape, taken away from Germany, just after his father returned from incarceration. And my father is taken from Berlin, where he waves goodbye for the last time to his parents. He didn't know that, but I'm sure they did. And he arrives in England and is taken same day, overnight, to Scotland. And he and his mates, he was lucky because many children went without knowing anyone. He went with a whole bunch of kids that he knew from school and from summer camp. And they find themselves in a farm school in Scotland, in the grounds belonging to the Balfour family. And the significance of that, of course, is that Lord Arthur Balfour was the author of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, from which one can begin a countdown to the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. So my father's first morning in Britain, he's in the same building where in the basement of that building, Lord Arthur Balfour signed the Balfour Declaration. And for a confirmed Zionist like my then 15-year-old father was, you can imagine that this was a very significant way to begin his new life in a new country, which had a language that he was very bad at first. So, although my father was born in Germany, his parents were Polish Jews, all his family that he mixed with in Berlin were Polish Jews, and he had absorbed a great deal of knowledge about Poles and Polish anti-Semitism. So when the Polish army in exile in Britain eventually called my father up to join their army in exile, he said, "No way, I will not serve the army of an anti-Semitic regime. That regime happens to be an ally of Britain in this war, does not make any difference, I will not serve." So instead, he joined the British Army. He never went overseas with the army, but he was helped to train soldiers going off to D-Day. I want to just move forward a few months. It is the summer of 1945. The Jewish Brigade, that's a talk all by itself, a British Army unit consisting of British Jews and Jewish Palestinians, was stationed in liberated Brussels, Belgium. A striking brunette walked up to a Jewish brigade soldier who was walking down the street. She spotted his Star of David pin. She marched up to him and she asked in Yiddish, "Do you know Yankee Fachler in England?" Now, I'd hardly be telling you this story if he turned round to her and he said, "No, how could I?" He knew my father. And he knew where my father was serving, in the army. And he got word through the army, through the authorities, and the army gave my father compassionate leave to come in his uniform to visit the remnant of his family in Belgium. He met with his aunt, Judith, and the rest of the family, and they told him that sometime after my father received his last Red Cross telegram from his parents in the spring of 1942, sometime between then and the end of the Holocaust, the end of the war, my father's parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts, and cousins had been murdered. Apart from the Belgian Fachlers, there are only 3 members of my father's family that survived the Holocaust. One uncle escaped from Poland to Russia, and I'm still in touch with his grandson. 2 other uncles of my father somehow survived the death camps, and after being in displaced persons camps at the end of the war, they returned to their hometown of Kielce in Poland in the spring of 1946. The presence of returning Jewish Holocaust survivors offended the good Catholic residents of Kielce. In July 1946, Polish civilians and policemen murdered these 2 uncles, together with 40 other Jews, in what is known as the Kielce pogrom. And I remind you, we're talking about 15 months after the end of World War II. It is estimated that 1,500 Jews were murdered in this way in the months after the war, and this led to a mass exodus of a couple of 100,000 Jews who thought that they were going to go home, and most of them then found their way eventually to what was to become Israel. Friends, I'm often asked, is there a need to commemorate the Holocaust? I think it's the wrong question. I think the real question is, have we learned anything from the Holocaust? And my answer is not enough. We recently saw Radovan Karadzic sentenced to genocide and crimes against humanity that were committed in the heart of Europe decades after the Holocaust. We saw the horrors of the Rwandan genocide decades after the Holocaust. On a daily basis, we see ISIS, the Islamic State, committing genocide wherever it can, and I can only characterize the response of the world as lukewarm. I don't believe we're doing half as much. We see the world paralyzed in its indecision and inaction as hundreds of thousands of Syrians have been killed. Last month, the Jewish Representative Council of Ireland, of which I am a member, commemorated Israel's official Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day. And for the event, I wrote a dramatization of the January 1942 Wannsee Conference, which approved Hitler's final solution. We know that over a banquet complete with fine wine and cigars, the conference delegates decided that 11 million Jews across Europe would be annihilated by gassing. These 11 million included Ireland's entire Jewish community of 4,000 souls. That's right. The Nazis knew where every single Jew in Ireland lived and would have absolutely sent, whether it was the guards or the Gestapo or anybody else, to arrest them and to send them to their deaths. When Hitler said he was going to get rid of the Jews, no one believed him. It's just talk, people said. We saw where that talk led. And today a new Hitler, the Iranian government, is boasting that it will annihilate Israel. And again, people, they're saying, it's just talk. It's just talk. Well, I can tell you that for my 94-year-old mum, who lives in Jerusalem, the Iranian threat doesn't sound like just talk. And when you're playing in the school playground in Petach Tikva, where my 3 grandchildren live, the Iranian threat doesn't sound like just talk. And when you see the message that the Iranians painted in Hebrew on their recently illegally test-launched missile with the words, "Israel must be wiped from the face of the earth," it doesn't sound like just talk. The Holocaust is part of my DNA. And I acknowledge that as a second-generation Holocaust survivor, I'm probably oversensitive to people who publicly state their intention to kill me and my people. Given my family history, I think I probably have the right to be oversensitive. In 1938, Neville Chamberlain proudly waved a piece of paper which proved that Hitler was a gentleman who would keep his word, and we all know the consequences. And in 2015, President Obama proudly waved a piece of paper which proved that the Iranian leaders were gentlemen who would keep their word not to develop nuclear weapons. I fear that Obama's ignorance of the lessons of the Holocaust may yet cost us all dearly. The Holocaust should have taught us to recognize the face of evil. But as a historian, as a Jew, as an Israeli, and as a grandson of people murdered for the crime of being Jewish, I fear the resurgence in Ireland and in the world of anti-Semitism and its mutant manifestation, anti-Zionism. I watch people trying to universalize the Holocaust. By watering down the particularly Jewish aspect of the Holocaust, they feel that they can now delegitimize the Jewish state. This happened here in Ireland when the Holocaust Memorial Day Committee banned mention of Israel at its ceremony. I fought against this. I won in that Israel is now mentioned. I lost because I lost my position after 12 years as the chair of that particular commemoration. But I think it was worth making a stand. Last month I participated in the Irish Times weekly news podcast on the subject of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. The vile language spouted by the anti-Israel participant in the podcast is indicative of the way Irish activists whip up hysterical hatred against the only state where Jews call home. This week, even Ireland's foreign minister, maybe not fair to mention this, we're talking about Charlie Flanagan, son of Oliver Flanagan, who I mentioned earlier, publicly stated that he regarded the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, as legitimate. I watch Labour Party members in the UK making the vile equation between Zionism and Hitler. I watch Israel being vilified in the United Nations by rogue nations and by cynical Western nations. I watch mothers, fathers, children and grandparents being stabbed in Jerusalem and other Israeli cities by knife-wielding Muslims claiming to be doing Allah's word. I watch terrorist atrocities committed in Brussels, in Paris and across the world. And I watch the recent hate crime in Glasgow, where a Muslim shopkeeper was murdered by a fellow Muslim. And do you know why he was murdered? Because his killer objected to him sending Easter greetings to his Christian customers. I watch Christian communities being targeted, as we saw recently in Lahore, Pakistan. I watch Christian communities throughout the Middle East under constant attack, while at the same time I take some pride in knowing that Israel is the only place in the Middle East where Christians are not under threat. Israel, the Jewish state, is the only place in the Middle East where Christians are not under threat. I think that tells us a great deal. I've shared with you some of the reflections of what it's like to be a second-generation Holocaust survivor, but I want to close on a happier note. I've spoken about my father, what happened to his family. Tell you a bit about my mum, who I'll be seeing, please God, in a couple of days in Jerusalem. She can't wait and I can't wait. How did she escape from Nazi Germany? Well, it began with her grandfather, who lived in Lithuania, dirt poor. And at the time, round about the turn of the century into the 20th century, many, many Jews from Lithuania sought their fortune in South Africa. This was the boom time, this was the gold and the diamonds. So off he goes, leaves his family behind to try and see if he can make a living in South Africa. After a year where he's got a little business going, he decides, this is it. I'm going to go and get my family and bring them, and we'll start all over again here in South Africa. So he went to get them passports. South Africa, of course, then was British, so effectively the passports that he got them, South African British passports. And in those days you could do that. He turned up, went home with 10 passports. named after all the people that he needed. And they pack up, and they're just about to leave Lithuania for South Africa when he gets a telegram from a cousin of his who went out with him to South Africa as well. He said, "Don't bother coming back. Your partner has run off with all the money." So they were already packed up, and so they decided, well, they're not staying anyway. The oldest son lived in Germany, so they said, right, we're going to Germany. And so the whole family decamps and goes to live in Germany. And my grandfather is born in Lithuania, but as a child joins the family and off they go to Germany, and he grows up as a good German Jewish boy. World War I, 1914. The Becker family are holding British passports. The German authorities say, "You're aliens, we are going to arrest you." So all the family says, "No, this is a bit of a joke, we've never been there, we don't know English, it's just grandfather got the passports, you know, leave us alone, we're fine." Except my grandfather, who marched up to the German authorities and says, "Yes," he says, "I'm an alien, arrest me, intern me." And so they interned him, and he spent the entire First World War in some luxury castle together with some Brits who were caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. And when he came out and married my grandmother, each of his two daughters that were born, my mum and her younger sister, my grandfather went to the British authorities and registered them as British subjects. In the 30s, the vast majority of my mum's family in Germany, with their British passports, waltzed their way into Palestine without needing any special permission, unlike most Jews who couldn't get in. And indeed, my great-grandfather is buried in Jerusalem on Mount of Olives. My grandfather decided he wasn't in a great hurry, he had things to do, and he was always aware that he had his passport. When crunch time came in 1938, before Kristallnacht, he and my grandmother and my mum and my aunt used their British passports and arrived in Britain, safe and sound. An amazing story that has no logic, but has the hand of the Lord somewhere in the story. I mentioned to you that my parents made a vow. It was a very explicit vow. This wasn't something in their head. My father hadn't heard from his parents. It was still the war, and so this was a real issue for my parents. And so it was something that they'd spoken about. And they said, we're going to rebuild this family. But let me tell you, as of today, where the rebuilding took them. As of Sabbath Eve yesterday, the number of direct descendants from that wedding: 7 children, 23 grandchildren, and 95 great-grandchildren. Now, there may have been a couple more in the last 24 hours, but it's Shabbat, so I haven't heard any. And most of those great-grandchildren, at least 70% of them, if not more, were born and live and raised in Israel. I want to pay public tribute to the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem, in particular, not just for their amazing support of Israel, but in particular for their commitment to helping Holocaust survivors in Israel live in dignity. Israel's Chief of Staff recently paid a visit to the retirement community in Jerusalem where my mum lives. General Eisenkot told the residents, the memory of the Holocaust acts as one of the foundations for the soldiers and commanders of the Israeli army. army. To which I say, Amen. Just got to add, off script. Last week, one of my nephews completed 6.5 months in the Israeli army, 6.5 years in the Israeli army as an officer. And he had been responsible in the last 2-3 years for training hundreds of soldiers. On the last day, he was the speaker, and some of his soldiers were walking around with T-shirts that said on them, "We've been Fachlered." So the name Fachler suddenly become a verb. And my brother, of course, very proud, and all of us were very proud, and we were all thinking, how proud for my dad. Ladies and gentlemen, I publicly refute the defamatory definitions that Israel's enemies give to Zionism. A Zionist is someone who supports and celebrates the right of the Jews to return to their ancient homeland after 2,000 years of persecution. And this was very eloquently described earlier by Paul. And the former chief rabbi of Ireland said last month, open a Jewish daily prayer book in any part of the world, and Zionism will leap out of every page. He continued, anyone who declares themselves anti-Zionist is insulting every Jew in the world, to which I would add, and not a few Christians as well. I stand before you as a proud Zionist, as the son, grandson, father, and grandfather of proud Zionists. And I will close by quoting what my father wrote in the last words of the vow. I am mindful of becoming a citizen of our own Jewish state after 2 millennia. And I am mindful of the merit of living in the capital of our Jewish state, Jerusalem. Thank you very much. Now, in one of those instances of, I do not like the word coincidence because I'm not really certain I believe in the term coincidence. As I came in this morning into this amazing space, I saw this hanging, front door, and without thinking, I recited the Hebrew, which of course I know. And I said to myself, you know what? I think it would be appropriate if I read this at the end of my words. As I am getting ready after our coffee break to come and do my thing, Mary comes up and she says, "No, I think it would be really nice if you did the Aaronic blessing." So, would you like to stand? Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. May the Lord bless you and keep you. Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'chuneka. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. May the Lord lift his countenance upon you and give you shalom, peace. Thank you very much.